Have you ever wondered what dark secrets might be buried in your family's past? What if the faded photographs in your grandmother's attic held truths so disturbing that uncovering them would forever change how you see yourself? Take a moment right now and consider, how well do you really know your own bloodline? Before we continue with tonight's story, I'd like to ask where you're watching from. Drop a comment below with your location. It helps us understand how far these forgotten histories have spread. And if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support allows us to continue unearthing these obscure chapters of history that powerful interests would prefer remain buried. The story of the Lecompton sisters begins in the winter of 1892 in the rolling plains of eastern Kansas. Douglas and Jefferson counties were still recovering from the tumultuous post-Civil War era, with communities working to rebuild both physically and socially. It was against this backdrop of renewal that the Lecompton sisters first arrived in Lawrence, Kansas, seemingly unremarkable in their matching gray dresses and demure demeanors. Elizabeth and Eleanor Lecompton presented themselves as respectable young women from St. Louis, seeking a quieter life after the passing of their parents. With their identical heart-shaped faces, copper-red hair, and soft-spoken manner, they quickly endeared themselves to the community. Elizabeth, who claimed to be older by 7 minutes, secured a position as an assistant at the county clerk's office, while Eleanor found work teaching piano to the children of Lawrence's more affluent families. The Lecompton sisters were like a breath of fresh air, recalled Millicent Drummond, one of the few surviving contemporaries interviewed by the Kansas Historical Society in 1947. They brought culture and refinement to our little community. Everyone was charmed by them, especially the unmarried men. Indeed, within 6 months of their arrival, Elizabeth Lecompton had become engaged to Howard Whitfield, the son of Lawrence's most prominent banker. 2 months later, Eleanor announced her engagement to Thomas Calloway, a promising young lawyer with political ambitions. The dual engagements became the talk of the town, with a double wedding planned for the spring of 1893. What no one in Lawrence suspected was that across the county line in Jefferson County, in the smaller community of Oskaloosa, 2 other young women had also recently arrived. They called themselves Catherine and Caroline Blackwood, and they too were identical twins with copper-red hair, though they wore it in different styles to help neighbors tell them apart. The Blackwood sisters claimed to be from Chicago, daughters of a deceased judge. Catherine quickly secured work as a governess for the 3 children of widowed mill owner Richard Pearson, while Caroline became the new postmistress, a position of considerable responsibility and access to information. Those Blackwood girls were just what this town needed. Samuel Thorne, former Jefferson County sheriff, noted in his unpublished memoir, "They brought sophistication without putting on airs." Before long, they were invited to every social gathering in the county. By the summer of 1892, Catherine Blackwood had accepted a marriage proposal from Richard Pearson, while Caroline had become engaged to Dr. James Wilford, Oskaloosa's only physician. Their weddings were scheduled just 2 weeks apart in the fall of the same year. What connects these seemingly unrelated events is a series of coincidences that would later prove to be anything but. The Lecompton sisters never appeared in public on the same days that the Blackwood sisters hosted gatherings in Oskaloosa. More tellingly, neither pair of twins ever mentioned having sisters to their respective communities. The first hint that something was amiss came from an unexpected source, the Kansas City Topeka stagecoach driver, Vernon Pike. In his regular route between the communities, Pike noticed a peculiar pattern. He would transport a copper-haired woman from Lawrence to the halfway point between the towns, where she would disembark, claiming to visit a sick aunt who lived nearby. Hours later, on his return journey, he would pick up what appeared to be the same woman at the same isolated crossroads, though now she would be headed toward Oskaloosa. "At first I thought nothing of it," Pike later testified, Plenty of folk have family scattered about these parts. But it was the sameness of it all. Same spot, same time of day, same carpet bag. And something about her eyes changed between morning and afternoon. Can't rightly explain it, but they did. Pike's observations might have remained merely curious had it not been for the discovery made in September of 1892. A severe thunderstorm washed out the road at Willow Creek Crossing, forcing Pike to take a detour that added 3 hours to his journey. Unable to make his usual stop at the crossroads, he continued directly to Oskaloosa, where he was surprised to find Miss Blackwood already in town, claiming she had arrived the previous day. 2 days later, when the roads were passable again, Pike transported Miss Lecompton from Lawrence to the crossroads as usual. But this time his curiosity piqued. He doubled back after dropping off his other passengers and observed from a distance. What he witnessed would later become key testimony. Miss Lecompton removed her hairpins, shook out her hair, and changed her dress behind a large oak tree. She then retrieved a different carpet bag from a hollow log and began walking briskly toward Oskaloosa. Pike reported his observations to Sheriff Thorne in Jefferson County, who initially dismissed them as fanciful. "Women are always changing their clothes and fixing their hair," he reportedly told Pike. "That's hardly cause for suspicion. The investigation might have ended there had it not been for an unexpected development in Douglas County. Howard Whitfield, Elizabeth Lecompton's fiancé, decided to surprise his betrothed with a visit to her lodgings one evening when she had claimed to be indisposed with a headache. Upon arriving at the boarding house run by Mrs. Abigail Foster, he was informed that Miss Lecompton had left early that morning, carrying a carpet bag and mentioning a trip to visit relatives. Confused and concerned, Whitfield waited in the parlor until nearly midnight, when Elizabeth finally returned, looking flushed and weary. When confronted about her absence, she became agitated, claiming Mrs. Foster had misunderstood. She had merely been walking to clear her head. The disagreement escalated when Whitfield noticed an unfamiliar man's handkerchief protruding from her reticule, embroidered with the initials R.P. "I've never seen Elizabeth so flustered," Whitfield later confided to his father. "It was as though she became a different person entirely. Her voice changed, her posture stiffened, and she looked at me with the coldest eyes I've ever seen." The handkerchief, as fate would have it, belonged to Richard Pearson of Oskaloosa, fiancé to Catherine Blackwood. This connection might never have been made had Pearson's mill not supplied lumber to Whitfield's father's bank for a new addition. When Whitfield mentioned the curious incident to his father, including the initialed handkerchief, the elder Whitfield made the connection and contacted Pearson directly. Pearson, equally confused, confirmed that his handkerchief had indeed gone missing during a recent carriage ride with his fiancée, Catherine Blackwood. More disturbing still, Catherine had been absent from Oskaloosa on the very day Elizabeth Lecompton had disappeared from Lawrence, claiming the same excuse, visiting family. The two men agreed to meet halfway between their towns at a tavern called the Crossroads Inn, coincidentally the very spot where Vernon Pike had observed the mysterious transformations. They brought with them daguerreotypes of their respective fiancés, and upon comparing them, were struck by the uncanny resemblance. Despite different hairstyles and clothing, Elizabeth Lecompton and Catherine Blackwood were undeniably the same woman. "I felt the floor drop from beneath me," Whitfield later wrote in a letter to his cousin in Boston. "The woman I had asked to be my wife, to whom I had opened my heart and home, was living a complete second life across the county line." And if Elizabeth was Catherine, then who was Eleanor? The answer, of course, was Caroline Blackwood. The twin sisters were not two sets of twins at all, but a single pair engaged in an elaborate deception. By maintaining 4 separate identities across 2 counties, they had become engaged to 4 of the area's most eligible bachelors simultaneously. But the web of deceit extended even further. Upon further investigation, Authorities discovered property deeds, life insurance policies, and bank accounts opened in the names of all 4 fiancés, with the sisters listed as beneficiaries. More troubling still were the small bottles of colorless liquid found in the sisters' belongings, later identified as arsenic compounds, and detailed notes on symptoms of arsenic poisoning, carefully disguised as recipe cards. The plan, as best we could reconstruct it, wrote District Attorney William Hayward in his case summary, was as methodical as it was monstrous. The sisters intended to marry all 4 men in quick succession, then systematically poison them over the course of the following year. As widows, they would inherit substantial properties and insurance payouts, then disappear before anyone could connect the seemingly unrelated deaths across county lines. But even this discovery represented merely the surface of a much deeper horror. As authorities began investigating the sisters' background, they found no record of Elizabeth and Eleanor Lecompton from St. Louis, nor Catherine and Caroline Blackwood from Chicago. They did, however, discover reports of similar pairs of twins operating in Nebraska, Missouri, and Iowa over the previous decade, always targeting wealthy men, always disappearing just before authorities closed in. Most disturbing of all was the discovery made in the sisters' Lawrence boarding house, hidden beneath a loose floorboard in their room, wrapped in oilcloth and secured with twine. Investigators found a journal dating back to 1877. The handwriting alternated between 2 distinct styles, and the entries detailed a pattern of deception, seduction, and murder stretching back 15 years. "We have perfected our method," read one entry dated March 1888. "The key is separation and recombination. We are never all 4 in the same place, never even both pairs. When I am Elizabeth, E is Catherine. When I am Eleanor, E is Caroline. We practice our voices daily to maintain consistency. The transformation at the crossroads has become second nature. Our faces may be identical, but our souls are fractured into the perfect instruments of acquisition." The journal entries revealed an even more unsettling truth. The Lecompton-Blackwood sisters had successfully implemented their scheme in at least 7 different communities before arriving in Kansas. The entries referenced 12 deceased husbands, methodically poisoned and mourned across 5 states. In each case, the sisters had collected substantial inheritances before vanishing, only to resurface with new identities in communities hundreds of miles away. Most chilling were the casual descriptions of their victims' suffering. "R convulsed for nearly 3 hours before the end," read one entry. "Too much at once, I believe. C argues for smaller doses over time, and I must concede she is correct. The prolonged illness creates less suspicion than a sudden death, though it requires more patience. We shall be more careful with the next." What makes this case particularly disturbing is not merely the calculated nature of the crimes, but the psychological complexity behind them. The journal revealed that the sisters, whose real names were never conclusively established, had developed an elaborate system of identity shifting that went beyond mere disguise. "When I am Eleanor, I am not merely playing a part," one sister wrote. "I become Eleanor entirely. Her thoughts, her mannerisms, her desires are mine because they are of my creation. Catherine exists only when I breathe life into her. We are not simply twins pretending to be 4 women. We are 4 women who happen to share 2 bodies." This fractured sense of self extended to their relationships with their intended victims. The journal entries suggest that each sister developed genuine feelings for her fiancé, even while planning his murder. "H held my hand today as we walked through the orchard," wrote Elizabeth of Howard Whitfield. "His touch causes such conflict within me. I long for it even as I know those fingers must eventually grow cold in mine. Perhaps I shall keep a memento. His signet ring would make a fine addition to our collection." The investigation came to a head in October 1892, when Sheriff Thorne and a deputy from Douglas County attempted to apprehend the sisters at their boarding house in Lawrence. They arrived to find the rooms empty, the sisters having fled sometime in the night. A search of the premises revealed that they had taken little with them. Only their journal, some personal items, and the arsenic compounds were missing. A statewide manhunt ensued, with descriptions of the sisters circulated to law enforcement agencies throughout the Midwest. Reported sightings came from as far away as Chicago and Denver, but none led to their capture. The case garnered national attention, with newspapers across the country dubbing it the dreadful doppelganger case and the Bigamy murders. Perhaps the most disturbing development came 3 weeks after the sisters' disappearance, when Howard Whitfield received a letter postmarked from St. Louis. Inside was a lock of copper-red hair tied with a blue ribbon, and a note in Elizabeth's handwriting that read, "My dearest Howard, a part of me shall always be yours, though I cannot be. Look for me in the faces of strangers, for I am everywhere and nowhere. With eternal devotion, Elizabeth." The same day, Richard Pearson received an identical package containing a lock of hair and a note signed Catherine, while Thomas Calloway and Dr. Wilford received theirs signed Eleanor and Caroline, respectively. The coordinated delivery of these mementos suggested the sisters were still working together and took perverse pleasure in reminding their former fiancés of how thoroughly they had been deceived. The following spring brought another disturbing turn to the case. Reports emerged from Oklahoma Territory of twin sisters calling themselves Victoria and Violet Thornfield, who had charmed their way into the confidence of 2 wealthy cattle ranchers. By the time the Kansas authorities were alerted and made the connection, the Thornfield sisters had vanished once again, leaving behind 2 dead ranchers and considerably depleted bank accounts. "It's the same pattern," Sheriff Thorne wrote to District Attorney Hayward. "They identify suitable targets, establish separate identities, form attachments, then eliminate their victims and disappear with the proceeds. They're refining their methods with each iteration. God help the next community where they surface." The years that followed brought occasional reports consistent with the sisters' methodology, though never with enough evidence to conclusively link them to the Lecompton-Blackwood case. Pairs of identical twins, with varying hair colors suggesting the use of dyes, appeared in communities across the expanding American West, from the mining towns of Colorado to the newly established settlements of Washington state. In each location, the pattern was similar: charm, deception, marriage, murder, inheritance, disappearance. By the turn of the century, authorities had attributed as many as 26 deaths to the sisters, though the true number may have been considerably higher. The last credible sighting came in 1907 in San Francisco shortly after the Great Earthquake. A physician treating survivors reported encountering elderly twin sisters with faded copper-red hair, working as volunteer nurses. He noted their extraordinary skill with medications and their particular interest in caring for wealthy male patients who had lost family in the disaster. There was something unsettling in their efficiency, Dr. Morris Blackwell wrote to the Kansas Historical Society in 1922. They moved about the ward like ghosts, always separate yet somehow connected, as though communicating without words. When I mentioned Kansas, thinking they might have come from the Midwest like myself, one sister's hand trembled slightly as she measured laudanum. It was the only time I saw either of them display anything but perfect composure. By the time Blackwell's letter reached authorities in Kansas, the sisters, if indeed it was them, had once again vanished without a trace. Their ultimate fate remains unknown, though rumors persisted for decades. Some claimed they had died in the influenza epidemic of 1918. Others insisted they had retired to a remote ranch in Mexico, living off their accumulated wealth. Still, others maintained that they had separated at last, each living under a new identity, perhaps not even aware of their shared past. The most disturbing theory, supported by scattered evidence but never confirmed, suggests that the sisters eventually took their deception to its logical extreme. According to this theory, they began operating not as two sets of twins, but as mother-daughter pairs, with one sister adopting a matronly disguise while the other maintained a youthful appearance. As the years passed, the roles would reverse, creating the illusion of a mother aging and a daughter maturing, while concealing the fact that both women were of the same generation. This theory gained credence in 1934, when authorities in Oregon investigated the case of Abigail and Pearl Watson, a mother and daughter who had been linked to the suspicious deaths of three wealthy lumbermen. Photographs of the pair showed a striking resemblance between them, despite their apparent age difference. By the time investigators connected them to the Kansas case, the Watsons had disappeared, leaving behind only a silver hand mirror, later identified as having belonged to Eleanor Lecompton. The final entry in the official case file came in 1949, when a retirement home in Florida reported the death of an elderly woman named Margaret Collins. Among her personal effects was found a locket containing 4 tiny portraits, young women with heart-shaped faces and copper-red hair, labeled Elizabeth, Eleanor, Catherine, and Caroline. The retirement home's records indicated that Collins had been visited regularly by a niece who bore a striking resemblance to her, but this woman never returned after Collins' death and could not be located. The case of the Lecompton sisters represents one of the most psychologically complex criminal enterprises in American history, wrote criminologist Edward Hayes in his 1963 analysis. Their ability to maintain multiple discrete identities while executing a consistent criminal methodology suggests a level of compartmentalization rarely seen outside of fiction. Were they born with this capacity for emotional detachment, or was it forged through some shared trauma? Without the sisters themselves to study, we can only speculate. Indeed, the true origins of the Lecompton sisters remain shrouded in mystery. No record exists of their birth or early childhood. The earliest confirmed reference to them comes from a school attendance record in Pennsylvania, dated 1873. Listing twins aged approximately 12 years as new students, though they attended for only one semester before disappearing. Some researchers have suggested that the sisters may have begun their criminal careers even earlier than the journal indicated, possibly learning the arts of deception and manipulation while traveling with a carnival or medicine show in their youth. Others point to evidence suggesting they may have been orphaned during the Civil War and raised in a series of foster homes where they learned to rely solely on each other and view the rest of humanity as marks to be exploited. Whatever their beginnings, the psychological bond between the sisters appears to have been their defining characteristic. The journal entries reveal a relationship so symbiotic that the boundaries between their identities became fluid, allowing them to share and exchange personas with remarkable ease. This fluidity extended beyond their criminal enterprise, suggesting that even in private moments, they continued their elaborate role-playing. "Last night I dreamt I was C," reads one entry. "Not that I was pretending to be C, but that I was her, thinking her thoughts, feeling her desires. When I woke, it took several minutes to remember who I truly was. Or perhaps I am still asleep, dreaming that I am E, dreaming of being C. Where does one sister end and the other begin? Perhaps there is no boundary at all." This blurring of identities extended to their victims as well. The journal describes the sisters' method of selecting targets based not only on wealth and vulnerability, but also on physical type. They appeared to seek out men who resembled one another, not identical, but sharing certain features that allowed the sisters to develop a consistent taste across their various personas. "H has the same cleft in his chin as J did," notes one entry. "When I touch it, I can almost believe I'm touching J again before the sickness took him." Perhaps all men are one man wearing different faces, just as we are two women wearing many. This unsettling philosophy, that identity itself is merely a construct to be donned or discarded at will, pervades the journal and suggests the true horror at the heart of the case. The Lecompton sisters did not merely pretend to be multiple people. In some fundamental way, they believed they actually were all of these women simultaneously. This fluidity of self allowed them to commit their crimes without apparent remorse, as though the sisters who formed loving attachments were entirely separate from the sisters who methodically murdered their husbands. As Dr. James Ellsworth of the Kansas State Psychiatric Hospital noted in his assessment, the typical criminal maintains a distinction between their public facade and their true intentions. What makes the Lecompton case so extraordinary is the absence of this distinction. They appear to have fully inhabited each role, believing themselves to be the loving fiancés even as they planned their betrayals. It is not so much a case of deception as of multiple simultaneous truths existing within the same individuals. This capacity for psychological fragmentation made the sisters not only effective criminals, but also impossible to track effectively. With each new identity, they appear to have shed the last completely, adopting not only new names and appearances, but new mannerisms, speech patterns, and personal histories. They became, in essence, new people, connected to their previous selves only by their shared physical form and criminal intent. The legacy of the Lecompton sisters extends beyond their immediate crimes. Their case inspired a wave of public fascination with the concept of dual identities and the potential for evil lurking behind respectable facades. Novels, plays, and eventually films drew inspiration from their story, though often sanitizing the more disturbing psychological elements in favor of simpler tales of deception and justice. More significantly, the case contributed to important developments in early forensic psychology and the study of identity disorders. The detailed journal, portions of which were made available to medical researchers in the early 20th century, provided unprecedented insight into the minds of individuals capable of sustained, complex deceptions. Some of the earliest academic work on multiple personality disorders reference the Lecompton case as an example of identity fragmentation in service of criminal enterprise. For the communities of Lawrence and Oskaloosa, the revelation of the sisters' plot left lasting scars. The men who had been deceived struggled with both public humiliation and private grief for the women they had loved, who had never truly existed. Several never married, unable to trust their own judgment in matters of the heart. Howard Whitfield, perhaps the most deeply affected, kept the lock of copper-red hair Elizabeth had sent him until his death in 1941, telling a nurse in his final days that he was still waiting for her to return. The boarding houses where the sisters had stayed became objects of morbid curiosity, with tourists and sensation seekers traveling considerable distances to see the rooms where such elaborate deceptions had been planned. Mrs. Foster, whose Lawrence boarding house suffered particularly from this unwanted attention, eventually sold the property at a loss and relocated to California, where she lived under her maiden name to avoid association with the case. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Lecompton sisters' legacy is the uncertainty surrounding their ultimate fate. Unlike most criminal cases, which conclude with either capture or confirmed death of the perpetrators, the Lecompton case offers no such resolution. The sisters simply vanished into the expanding American landscape, potentially continuing their criminal enterprise for decades under countless new identities. This lack of closure has fed decades of speculation and reported sightings. Throughout the first half of the 20th century, law enforcement agencies across the country received thousands of reports from citizens claiming to have encountered the infamous twins. Most were easily dismissed, but a significant number contained details specific enough to warrant investigation. In 1921, a bank manager in Oregon reported twin sisters in their 50s opening separate accounts on the same day, each depositing nearly identical sums. By the time authorities investigated, the women had withdrawn their funds and disappeared. In 1936, a wedding photographer in Montana noticed an elderly woman attending two different ceremonies in neighboring towns on consecutive weekends, each time accompanying a different bride whom she claimed was her granddaughter. When questioned, both brides gave different names for their grandmother, but described her in identical terms. As late as 1958, a retirement community in Florida reported unusual behavior involving elderly twin sisters who alternated weeks in the same apartment, each claiming to live there alone and denying the existence of a sister. Staff became suspicious only when they realized that the woman's hair changed subtly from week to week, suggesting the use of different dyes or wigs. None of these reports led to apprehension or confirmation, leaving the final chapter of the Lecompton sisters' story forever unwritten. This ambiguous ending perhaps explains the case's enduring fascination. The sisters exist in a state of perpetual possibility, neither captured nor confirmed dead, potentially still moving among us under new guises even today. The most terrifying aspect of the case, wrote Sheriff Thorne in his final report before retirement, is not what these women did, but what they were. They represent a kind of emptiness. Human forms without fixed identities, capable of becoming anyone while truly being no one. They walked among us, wearing the masks of kindness and normalcy, and we never saw the void behind their eyes until it was too late. Indeed, the question that continues to haunt those who study the case is not simply who the Lecompton sisters were, but what they were. What combination of innate predisposition and life experience could create individuals capable of such sustained and elaborate deception? Were they sociopaths from birth, or were they shaped by circumstance into the predators they became? Did they see their victims as people at all, or merely as resources to be harvested? The journal offers tantalizingly incomplete answers. In its pages, one can glimpse moments of apparent genuine connection with their intended victims, suggesting that the sisters were capable of something approximating love, even if that emotion was ultimately subordinated to their criminal enterprise. There are entries describing pleasant afternoons spent in the company of their fiancés, the simple pleasures of shared meals and conversations that seem divorced from any criminal intent. Yet these same pages contain meticulous notes on poison dosages and symptoms, calculations of expected inheritance amounts, and dispassionate observations on their victims' deteriorating health. This juxtaposition of tenderness and clinical detachment is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire case. The suggestion that for the Lecompton sisters, love and murder were not contradictory impulses, but complementary phases of the same relationship cycle. I held his hand as the fever took hold, reads one of the final entries in the recovered journal. His eyes, cloudy with confusion, still sought mine with such trust. Even now, as the poison does its work, he believes in the fiction I have created for him. In these moments, I almost wish Elizabeth were real, that she could continue loving him beyond his death and her inevitable disappearance. But Elizabeth will die when he does, to be reborn with a new name in a new place. Only we remain constant, my sister and I, eternal, despite our changing faces. This philosophical musing suggests a worldview in which identity itself is merely a temporary convenience, to be adopted and discarded as circumstances require. For the Lecompton sisters, each new name represented not just a disguise, but a complete persona with her own history, preferences, mannerisms, and future, all carefully crafted to appeal to specific targets and extract maximum advantage before being shed like an outgrown skin. This fluidity of self extended to their victims as well. The journal describes the sisters' method of selecting targets based not only on wealth and vulnerability, but also on physical type. They appeared to seek out men who resembled one another, not identical, but sharing certain features that allowed the sisters to develop a consistent taste across their various personas. H has the same cleft in his chin as J did, notes one entry. When I touch it, I can almost believe I'm touching J again before the sickness took him. Perhaps all men are one man wearing different faces, just as we are two women wearing many. This unsettling philosophy, that identity itself is merely a construct to be donned or discarded at will, pervades the journal and suggests the true horror at the heart of the case. The Lecompton sisters did not merely pretend to be multiple people. In some fundamental way, they believed they actually were all of these women simultaneously. For the residents of Lawrence and Oskaloosa, the revelation of such profound deception within their communities shattered the sense of security and trust that had previously characterized their small-town existence. How could they have been so thoroughly fooled? What signs had they missed? And most disturbing of all, if the Lecompton sisters could move among them undetected for months, who else might be wearing a false face in their midst? People stopped trusting newcomers after that, Millicent Drummond recalled in her interview with the Historical Society. Any stranger was viewed with suspicion, especially women traveling alone. I remember when the Henderson sisters, real sisters mind you, moved to Lawrence in 1894 to open a millinery shop. They were nearly driven out of town before the minister's wife vouched for their family back in Ohio. That's what the Lecompton case did to us. It poisoned our trust, even in the most innocent. This atmosphere of suspicion extended to existing residents as well. Long-standing community members began to question one another's backgrounds and histories, wondering what secrets might be hiding behind familiar faces. Records show an increase in requests for documentation of marriages, births, and property transactions in both counties following the case, as citizens sought to verify information they had previously accepted without question. The case also had significant implications for law enforcement practices across the Midwest. The sisters' ability to operate simultaneously in multiple jurisdictions exposed weaknesses in communication between county sheriffs and town marshals. In direct response, Kansas established one of the first formal interstate communication protocols for law enforcement in 1893, requiring regular information sharing between counties regarding unusual crimes or suspects. But perhaps the most profound impact was on the collective psyche of these communities. The idea that evil could wear such a benign, even attractive face, that it could charm its way into homes and hearts before revealing its true nature, struck at the very foundation of rural American identity. The myth of the small town as a haven of safety and moral clarity was permanently damaged. "We knew there were dangers in the world," wrote Thomas Calloway in a personal letter years after his narrow escape from marriage to Eleanor Lecompton. "But we believed we could recognize them. The highwayman, the rustler, the con man, these figures were familiar from dime novels and newspaper accounts. But the Lecompton sisters looked like the women we had grown up with, spoke like ladies of refinement, and appealed to our highest instincts of chivalry and protection. They weaponized our virtues against us. How does one guard against such a thing?" Indeed, the psychological sophistication of the sisters' approach far exceeded the typical criminal enterprises of the era. Rather than relying on force or obvious deception, they cultivated genuine emotional attachments, creating relationships so seemingly authentic that their victims willingly offered access to their homes, businesses, and finances. It was this emotional groundwork that made their planned poisonings all the more chilling. The victims would have accepted medicine from the very hands that were slowly killing them, never suspecting the betrayal until it was too late. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the Lecompton case gradually transformed from immediate threat to historical curiosity to near legend. The passage of time allowed for more objective analysis of the sisters' methods and motivations, but it also introduced elements of exaggeration and romanticism absent from the original reports. By the 1920s, the sisters had become stock characters in pulp fiction, typically portrayed as purely evil temptresses rather than the psychologically complex figures suggested by their journal. A 1927 silent film, The Devil's Doubles, loosely based on the case, portrayed them as literal demons in human form, complete with a scene in which their shadows reveal horns and tails, invisible to their unsuspecting fiancés. This simplification perhaps served a psychological purpose for the public, transforming an uncomfortably ambiguous threat into a more manageable fictional monster. It was easier to believe the sisters had been obviously evil than to accept the more disturbing reality that they had been indistinguishable from the women around them, that their capacity for both apparent love and calculated murder had existed within seemingly normal human psychology. Academic interest in the case continued, however, with each generation of psychologists and criminologists finding new aspects to explore. In the 1950s, researchers began examining the case through the lens of emerging theories about twin psychology and the development of shared delusions. The 1970s brought feminist reinterpretations that positioned the sisters as extreme examples of women using the limited power available to them in a male-dominated society. Modern analyses have focused on the neuroscience of identity formation and the biological basis of empathy, or its absence. Yet for all this scholarly attention, the central mystery remains unsolved. Who were the Lecompton sisters really? What were their true names, their origins, their ultimate fate? Did they continue their deadly enterprise into the 20th century? Did they eventually separate, each pursuing her own path, or did they meet with violence themselves, perhaps at the hands of a potential victim who discovered their true nature? The most compelling evidence that the Lecompton sisters might have continued their activities into the modern era came in 1962, when a researcher at the Kansas Historical Society received an anonymous package containing a silver hand mirror, identical to the one found among the Watson possessions in Oregon decades earlier, and a single sheet of paper with spidery handwriting that read, "We are still here. We are everywhere and nowhere. We are everyone and no one." Handwriting analysis confirmed similarities with the original journal entries, suggesting that at least one of the sisters might still have been alive 70 years after their initial crimes. An elderly woman by then, but still actively maintaining her connection to her infamous past. The postmark indicated the package had been mailed from Seattle, but investigations there yielded no further clues. The final documented connection to the Lecompton case occurred in 1978, when a nursing home in Vermont reported the death of an elderly resident named Victoria Emerson, who had lived there for 6 years. Among her possessions was found a small leather-bound book containing pressed flowers, each labeled with a man's name and a date. 15 names in all, spanning from 1877 to 1923. The book also contained a faded photograph of twin girls with copper-red hair, standing before a painted backdrop of a garden. On the back, written in fading ink, were the words, "Elizabeth and Eleanor, Catherine and Caroline, Victoria and Violet. We contain multitudes." When authorities attempted to investigate further, they discovered that all records related to Victoria Emerson's admission to the facility had mysteriously disappeared. Staff remembered her as a charming, well-spoken woman who often entertained others with stories of her extensive travels, though she never mentioned family except for a twin sister who had died years earlier. More curious still, no death certificate was ever filed for Victoria Emerson, and the funeral home listed in the nursing home's records had no record of receiving her remains. This final mysterious disappearance seems a fitting conclusion to a case defined by vanishings and transformations. Did Victoria Emerson fake her own death one last time, emerging with yet another identity despite her advanced age? Was she truly one of the infamous Lecompton sisters, still practicing her lifelong arts of deception? Or was this merely an elaborate hoax perpetrated by someone familiar with the historical case? In the absence of definitive evidence, the Lecompton sisters have been consigned to that shadowy realm between history and legend. Their case appears in criminology textbooks as an early example of identity manipulation for criminal purposes, and in psychology literature as a case study in shared psychopathy between twins. For the communities they terrorized, they represent a cautionary tale about trust and appearances that continues to resonate. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the case is not what we know about the sisters, but what remains unknown. Their true origins, the full extent of their crimes, their ultimate fate, all remain shrouded in mystery. This ambiguity allows for the unsettling possibility that their legacy continued far beyond the documented cases, that their methods were adopted by others, or that they themselves adapted to changing times and continued their predations well into the modern era. This uncertainty is reflected in the local folklore that developed around the case. In Douglas and Jefferson counties, parents for generations warned children against wandering alone, lest they encounter the twins who could change their faces and steal their identities. Local legend holds that on certain autumn evenings, when the mist rises from the creek at the old crossroads, one might glimpse a copper-haired woman changing her clothes behind the ancient oak tree, transforming from one sister to another before vanishing into the gathering darkness. Such stories serve as a psychological repository for the unresolved fears the case inspired. The Lecompton sisters violated not just laws, but the fundamental trust that binds communities together. They exploited the very best qualities in their victims, love, trust, generosity, and turned these virtues into vulnerabilities. In doing so, they forced a kind of collective loss of innocence, a recognition that evil can wear the most benign, even beloved face. Modern criminal profilers have suggested that the sisters represent an early example of what would now be classified as psychopathic behavior, individuals capable of mimicking normal human emotions while feeling none of the ethical constraints that typically accompany them. Their extraordinary success in maintaining multiple identities simultaneously suggests not just practiced deception, but a kind of emptiness at their core, a lack of fixed identity that allowed them to become whatever was most advantageous in a given situation. The true horror of the Lecompton case, noted forensic psychologist Dr. Rebecca Lansing in a 2003 analysis, lies not in what these women did, but in what they suggest about the nature of identity itself. If two individuals could so completely fragment themselves into multiple personas, each seemingly authentic to those who encountered them, what does this imply about the solidity of any human personality? The sisters make us question whether the people we meet, even those we love, are truly as they appear. This existential discomfort explains the case's enduring fascination. The Lecompton sisters force us to confront uncomfortable questions about appearance versus reality, about the knowability of others, and about the potential for deception in even our most intimate relationships. They represent the ultimate outsiders, women who observed the social contract only to identify its weaknesses, who studied human connection only to exploit it. In the decades since their disappearance, numerous books, films, and television programs have drawn inspiration from the Lecompton case, though most fictional treatments simplify the psychological complexities for dramatic effect. The 2007 novel Sister Mirror by Elizabeth Crane perhaps comes closest to capturing the disturbing fluidity of identity that characterized the original case, portraying the twins as so deeply intertwined psychologically that they periodically exchanged identities, even in private, blurring the boundaries between self and other until neither was certain which sister she had originally been. The most recent scholarly examination of the case, published in 2020 by the Journal of Historical Criminology, used modern forensic techniques to analyze the limited physical evidence preserved from the original investigation. Researchers were able to extract partial fingerprints from the journal covers and compare them to prints taken from letters sent to the former fiancés years after the sisters' disappearance. The analysis confirmed that the same individuals had handled both sets of documents, suggesting that the sisters had indeed maintained some connection to their former lives, even as they constructed new identities elsewhere. More intriguing still was the DNA analysis of hair samples preserved from both the Lawrence and Oskaloosa investigations. While the technology to fully sequence these samples does not yet exist, researchers were able to determine that the hair came from identical twins, confirming the core premise of the case and dispelling theories that more than two women might have been involved in the deception. These scientific confirmations lend weight to the historical accounts, but do little to resolve the case's central mysteries. Who were these women, really? What forces shaped them into such effective predators? And how many lives did they claim before their deaths? For the communities once terrorized by the Lecompton sisters, these questions have gradually lost their urgency. The towns of Lawrence and Oskaloosa have evolved over the decades, their populations changed, their collective memories focused on more recent events. Few current residents know the details of the case beyond its broad outlines, and fewer still give it much thought in their daily lives. Yet in certain older buildings, the former boarding house in Lawrence, now converted to offices, the old Pearson home in Oskaloosa, still standing though much altered, residents occasionally report strange phenomena: the sound of a woman's laughter where no one stands, the faint scent of lavender perfume in empty rooms, the sensation of being watched by unseen eyes. Whether these reports represent genuine paranormal activity or merely the power of suggestion in locations associated with notorious events remains, like so much about the Lecompton case, a matter of speculation. What is certain is that the sisters, whatever their true names might have been, recognized and exploited a fundamental vulnerability in human psychology: our desire to believe in the authenticity of those we love. They understood that people see what they expect to see, hear what they wish to hear, and trust where their hearts lead them. This insight allowed them to move undetected among their victims, hidden not by elaborate disguises, but by the simple, terrible fact that no one was looking for them. "The most perfect disguise," reads one of the final entries in their recovered journal, "is invisibility through visibility. We hide in plain sight, concealed not by shadows, but by the light of false confidence we inspire in others. They look at us and see only what we have trained them to see, reflections of their own desires, mirrors of their own hopes. They never see us at all." This chilling philosophy represents perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Lecompton case, a reminder that our perceptions of others are always partial, filtered through our own expectations and desires. The sisters exploited this fundamental limitation of human connection, turning it from a necessary acceptance of mystery into a fatal vulnerability. In this sense, the story of the Lecompton sisters serves as more than a historical curiosity or a lurid tale of 19th-century crime. It functions as a kind of parable about trust and deception, about the limits of knowing others, and about the shadowy boundaries between identity and performance. It reminds us that the face someone presents to the world may be just one of many, and that behind the most convincing performance may lie intentions we cannot begin to fathom. For the citizens of Kansas who first encountered this disturbing truth in 1892, the revelation came too late to prevent tragedy. For those who hear their story today, it serves as a haunting reminder of the darkness that may lurk behind the most charming smile, the most seemingly sincere declaration of love, the most perfect facade of normalcy. And somewhere, perhaps, in the fading light of an autumn evening, an elderly woman sits at her vanity, brushing copper-red hair gone silver with age, watching her reflection transform as the light changes. Is she remembering the many names she has worn throughout her long life, the faces she has loved and betrayed, the lives she has taken and the identities she has discarded? Or is she simply another elderly woman with no connection to these long-ago events, made uneasy by her own reflection for reasons she cannot name? The true power of the Lecompton case lies in this final ambiguity, the knowledge that we cannot know for certain, that identity itself remains the most perfect disguise, and that the boundaries between self and other, between authenticity and performance, between love and manipulation, are far more permeable than we might wish to believe. As Sheriff Thorne wrote in his final notes on the case before his death in 1928, "I still find myself studying the faces of twin women I encounter, though I know the sisters would be ancient now if still alive. Some habits of vigilance once acquired cannot be set aside. They taught us to doubt, and in that doubt, perhaps, lies our only protection against their like in the future. Look closely at those you trust most completely, not with suspicion, but with the humble recognition that no human heart is ever fully knowable to another." This warning echoes through the decades, a somber counterpoint to the more sensational aspects of the case. Beyond the lurid details of poisonings and false identities lies a profound truth about human vulnerability, our need to trust, to connect, to believe in the authenticity of those we love. The Lecompton sisters exploited this need with methodical precision, turning virtue into vulnerability and trust into a weapon against their victims. Yet even as their story serves as a caution, it also affirms, by negative example, the value of authentic connection. The horror we feel at their deceptions reflects our understanding that genuine trust is essential to human flourishing, that a world in which we must constantly suspect the intentions of others would be unlivable. The sisters represent a perversion of normal human bonding, a dark mirror in which we see reflected our own capacity for both trust and betrayal. In this light, perhaps the most fitting memorial to their victims is not continued fear, but renewed appreciation for authentic relationship, for connections built not on deception and exploitation, but on mutual vulnerability and care. The story of the Lecompton sisters reminds us of the darkness that exists at the margins of human experience, but it need not convince us that such darkness is the norm. As we close this unsettling chapter of Kansas history, we are left with questions that extend far beyond the specific details of this case. How well can we ever know another person? What lies behind the faces presented to us by those we think we know? And how do we balance necessary trust with equally necessary caution? These questions have no simple answers, no formula that guarantees safety while allowing for human connection. Each generation must negotiate this tension anew, learning to trust without naivety, to love without willful blindness, to connect without surrendering critical judgment. The Lecompton sisters, in their terrible way, have given us a gift of awareness, a reminder that appearances can deceive, that evil sometimes wears a beautiful face, and that true discernment requires looking beyond surface charm to the patterns of behavior that reveal authentic character. If we heed this lesson without surrendering to paranoia, perhaps their legacy need not be only one of fear. For those who wonder if similar predators move among us today, the answer is almost certainly yes. Human nature remains constant across the centuries, and every society contains individuals who view others merely as means to their own ends. Yet these individuals remain the exception rather than the rule, the dark background against which normal human goodness and trustworthiness stand in relief. The story of the Lecompton sisters belongs now to history and to the shadowy realm of rural legend. Their journal rests in the secure archives of the Kansas Historical Society, available only to qualified researchers. Their photographs, the few that remain, gaze out from the pages of criminology textbooks, their copper-red hair and heart-shaped faces preserved in sepia tones, their eyes revealing nothing of the minds behind them. And somewhere, perhaps in fading memory or family lore, traces of their passage through the world remain. Stories told by descendants of those who encountered them, fragments of lives touched by their deception, echoes of the terror they once inspired. In this tenuous connection to the present, they achieve a kind of immortality, becoming less specific historical figures than archetypes of deception and predation. Let us remember them not with fascination alone, but with the sober recognition that the darkness they embodied remains a possibility within human experience. Let us look more carefully at those who enter our lives, not with suspicion, but with discernment, seeking the authentic person behind the presented self. And let us value all the more those relationships built on genuine trust and mutual vulnerability, knowing how rare and precious such connections can be. For in the end, the story of the Lecompton sisters is not just about deception and murder, but about the eternal human struggle to know and be known, to connect across the inevitable distance between souls. Their perversion of this fundamental human project reminds us of its essential value, even as it cautions us against too readily assuming its presence in every charming smile or declaration of love. And as we close this dark chapter of Kansas history, let us turn our hearts toward the light of genuine human connection, guided by faith that though evil exists in this world, it need never have the final word. For those who walk in the light of truth and compassion, the shadows cast by such predators may serve as warnings, but never as deterrents from the essential human project of loving and being loved in return. May God bless you and keep you safe from such darkness in your own life. May Jesus Christ guide your discernment and protect your heart from deception, and may you find, in authentic connection with others, the antidote to the poison of manipulation and betrayal that the Lecompton sisters spread throughout their terrible, fascinating lives. Remember, the face of evil often appears beautiful at first glance. Look deeper, trust wisely, and keep safe the treasure of your own authentic self, the greatest defense against those who would use false identity as a weapon against the unwary. The true horror of the Lecompton case lies not in the gruesome details of poisonings or the calculating nature of the sisters' plans, but in the fundamental existential question it forces us to confront. If identity itself can be so fluid, if the face presented to the world can be so completely divorced from true intention, then how can we ever truly know another person? This question echoes across the decades, as relevant now as it was when the copper-haired twins first arrived in Lawrence, their hearts already set on deception and murder, their smiles revealing nothing of the darkness within.